It's May 5th, 1215, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Arion, Rebecca, and Olly, the Retrospectors.
What do we want? More power. When do we want it? In 5 weeks' time, after we've marched to the capital and forced King John to sign the Magna Carta, the rebel barons might have said. Today in history, in 1215, when ahead of forming the army that would force the English king to agree to something a bit more like democracy, they renounced their allegiance to him, despite everything he'd done for them, like burdening them with high taxes and imprisoning them without trial.
Yeah, because it was pretty good to be the king at this point in time. So King John was the third of the Angevin kings, and all of them ruled very much with this principle of vis et voluntas, which is force and will.
I'm big dog. That's what that means.
Yeah, I'm big dog. That's what. that's a looser translation. But basically, that had really upset enough barons simultaneously that, alongside a bunch of their own individual grievances, the sort of general alliance was this common cause that they basically wanted to stop King John from taking their money and their land.
Yeah, at this point, the relationship between John and the barons, it kind of reminded me of, those American cults when you watch those US TV shows. It got a little bit out of control. He was trying to marry people off to other people. He was trying to take all of their money, imposing lots of strange, kind of changing rules on them, most of which were just attempts to extort more and more money out of them. And one of the main ways he did this was through this practice called scutage, which technically was supposed to be a way that if you had these sort of feudal obligations of performing military service to the lord, and obviously the king being the ultimate lord, you could buy your way out. But in practice, it had basically just become a levy on landholders to fund wars. And John just kept doing it pretty much every single year of his reign. Really, you were only supposed to do it in a time of emergency to fight a specific war. He was just doing it every year as an additional way to raise money. And the reason that he had to do this in the first place was that when he had come to the throne, he was obviously is known to us as the King of England, but was also the king of pretty much most of what's now France, like the whole sort of west side of France, most of Normandy as well. And in the first few years of his reign, he had managed to lose a huge chunk of the French part of the kingdom to Philip II, King of France, very careless. And then he spent, it was a gambler's fallacy. He spent the next 10 years trying to get it back, which just meant spending more and more money. It wasn't working, so there was less and less enthusiasm to participate in these incredibly expensive and bloody wars against France. So there was a real John fatigue at this point.
But there was also the Holy Wars, the Crusades that he was funding, which, not just he, but his predecessor, his brother, Richard the Lionheart, but also their father, Henry II, had instigated. So really, he's just carrying on in the family tradition. And all of these baron guys were quite happy with that stuff when it was being done in the name of religion. They just didn't want to have any extra taxes to pay for it. I mean, that's basically it, isn't it? Faced with a massive government debt, he decided basically to tax the rich, which I think you'll find these days is seen as progressive politics. They were just upset about it.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing is that John just could not read a room. At this point, there was no modern parliament. There weren't really any checks and balances on the power of the king. And the whole system and, the harmony of the state relied on the king, who technically had no limitations on his power, listening to and gracefully accepting, guidance from his advisors, from the barons, from the court. And John just wasn't particularly interested in that. He was known for being extremely heavy-handed, and he offended not only the English nobles, but also the French nobles in the territories he still controlled in France with his really arbitrary and very taxing demands. He didn't give much credit to the dignity of the office of aristocrat. If you couldn't pay this sudden tax he just announced on you, he had absolutely no hesitation about taking all of your stuff, having it carried out of your house in a load of carts, having you locked in prison. He just did not really respect the barons at all. And in return, they obviously had lost patience with John by this point. And the turning point came in the summer of 1214. He lost the Battle of Bouvines in Flanders, at which point he was forced to hand over what remained of the Angevin Empire, the parts of France that England controlled. So at this point, he basically lost everything in his French territories, and the barons thought this was a really good moment to decide they were going to cut their own ties with him.
Yeah, so in January 1215, King John held a council in London to discuss the reforms and sponsored these talks in Oxford between his agents and the rebel barons, which is thoroughly decent of him as kind of God's representative on earth, I would say. And then both sides actually sought the help of Pope Innocent III during these negotiations. And the barons initially presented a document called the Unknown Charter of Liberties, because we should note at this point, we're obviously building towards Magna Carta, but there had been a bunch of charters that preceded this historical moment, and this particular one that was presented to King John eventually drew heavily on King Henry I's Charter of Liberties. Basically, King John had a look at it and he was like, I'm just going to try and have a think about what you have proposed. In the background, he was seeking out moral support from the Pope, and that's actually why he was delaying his response.
Because, by the way, getting a response back from the Pope took like 2 months. That's the thing to bear in mind. You can't just pick up the phone, obviously, in 1215.
Yeah, you need to get your fastest horse rider. And so he was also simultaneously recruiting mercenaries from France. So he had a plan B.
Well, you could see why the rebel barons might think that the Pope would be a great ally to have, because he had actually excommunicated John in 1209 after a series of disagreements. But he did manage to win the Pope around sufficiently that when John then offered to put the whole affair before the Pope and have him be the ultimate arbiter, the barons were not very attracted to this prospect. So instead, both sides settled on Stephen Langton, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury, and he sort of took their demands and turned them into a document that he called the Articles of the Barons, because it wouldn't start being called Magna Carta until a few years later.
Yeah, I feel like if the Articles of the Barons was one of the founding principles of the United States Declaration of Independence, it would not have the same ring to it as Great Charter in Latin.
Less we the people.
Yeah, exactly. They needed some military might, obviously, behind their threats. So you end up with Robert Fitzwalter leading the rebel barons. He called himself Marshal of the Army of God and Holy Church, which is, I mean, if you're going to self-appoint, go grand, I think. Go big or go home. And to prove they meant business, they captured London. They started in Northampton, but they were like, well, this is not sufficient to really grab the king's attention. Let's do London. And that's really what forced King John to meet them in Runnymede.
And that's where the Archbishop of Canterbury gets involved. And so he presents Magna Carta to King John, and under duress, John does agree to sign it.
Well, he doesn't sign, he seals. Important distinction.
At the end of the day, it doesn't matter whether it was his or not, because neither side obeyed what was in it.
I know, they completely ignored it.
That's true.
Completely. He may as well have just, signed it with a kiss, because within a few months, both sides had completely abandoned the Magna Carta. It's funny, we think of it as being this foundational document, but at the time, it had literally no impact.
Okay, so why do we still know the name Magna Carta? The reason is because it's the first document in European history, anyway, to put into writing the principle that the king and his government is not above the law. Everything else, like all the other 63 different clauses setting out rules concerning land ownership and taxes and people's legal rights, are very specific to that particular era. But that basic principle that the king is not above the law and that people should be tried fairly, quote, no man shall be arrested or imprisoned except by the judgment of their equals. That obviously is what's still resonant with us now, and we still have versions of those laws on our statute books now.
Yeah, there are a few clauses of the Magna Carta that get quoted and get referred to over and over again, but most of them are about, they are very specific grievances. One of them forbids any member of the Date family from serving as a royal officer. It's obviously somebody's grudge.
I wish that had lasted.
Stupid Dates.
Yeah.
Another one about ordering the removal of fish weirs from rivers. That was to do with impeding river traffic, probably very significant to the person who inserted it in there at the time. And also some of them not very inspiring when it comes to liberty. One of the clauses is that no one shall be arrested or imprisoned on the appeal of a woman for the death of any person except her husband.
Wow. That's quite interesting because for women, generally, it was quite progressive for the time. And we're talking about 1215. But it stipulated that widows were to enter their dowers and inheritance without charge and difficulty. And also protected widows from compulsory remarriage. So I suppose good for women that had already married to a dead man. Maybe not so much for those who weren't married. And this whole business about free men, it was worth just lingering on that as well. All the stuff that's then sort of lifted and talked about as if it means freedom for all men, i.e. all mankind, i.e. men and women. It doesn't mean that. Free men means aristocratic landowning men.
Wait a second. The barons were in it for themselves, you're saying? How unexpected.
Tomorrow.
He can open up his Sony Walkman and explode helicopters with buttons.
Ditch the ads and get a Sunday episode when you join Club Retrospectors. Patreon.com/retrospectors.